man who told this story was 24 years old. He was alone in a logging cabin in a forest where the trees were older than Norway itself. And on the third night, she walked out from between the spruce, and she smiled at him, and she said his name. I'm the Midnight Whisperer. Tonight's story comes from the Klæbu district of Sør-Trøndelag in central Norway in the winter of 1987. It is real. The man who lived through it told it to his brother. His brother told it to a folklorist. The folklorist recorded it in 1991, and the recording is still kept in a glass case in Oslo. I have read the transcript. Some of you, if you grew up in a village with a forest behind it, already know which rule he broke. This is part 1 of 2. By the end of part 2, you will understand why nobody in his family will go into the woods after dark, and why the cabin he stayed in has been abandoned ever since. Headphones recommended, lights off, stay with me. His name was Jonas Aas. He was the kind of young man Norway makes by the thousand every generation and then sends out into the cold. Tall, thin, quiet, strong shoulders from a childhood of carrying firewood, a face that was almost handsome but never quite, eyes the color of river stones. He had grown up in Levanger, a small town on a fjord where his father worked the docks and his mother taught primary school. He had 2 brothers and a sister. He had never been south of Oslo. He had never been on an airplane. And in the autumn of 1986, when the timber companies came through the coastal towns, offering winter contracts inland, he signed his name on a piece of paper and he took the money and he went. He needed the money. There was a girl, of course, and she lived in Trondheim, and she was studying at the university to become an architect, and Jonas had it in his head that if he could put 6 weeks of contract pay together, he could ask her to marry him before the spring thaw. He did not tell anyone this. He was the kind of man who held things very close to his chest. He was the kind of man, his brother would say later, who would walk into a forest and not tell you where he was going because he did not want anyone to worry. The contract was for a small operation, 3 men, a foreman, a logger, and a Sami tracker who came along to handle the snowmobile and the dogs, and to know where the slope of the land would betray you in a whiteout. The cabin was 60 kilometers from the nearest road, 60 kilometers in a Norwegian winter through old-growth pine, with snow that came up past your hip in places. You did not walk out of there. The supply runs came every 9 days. If you were hurt, you waited. The foreman's name was Henrik Solberg. He was 58 years old that winter. He had been logging the inland forests of Trøndelag since he was 16. His face was a map of weather. His hands were the kind of hands that have held an axe for so many decades that they no longer fully open when relaxed. He had buried 2 wives and 1 son. He drank black coffee from morning until the moment he closed his eyes, and he never spoke unless he had something to say. The Sami tracker was a man named Aslak Sarah. He was 41. He was from a reindeer herding family in Finnmark, far up in the Arctic, and he had come south for the wages. He spoke Norwegian softly, with the long vowels of the north, and he spoke North Sami to the dogs, and he never once entered the forest without first taking a small bone, which he kept on a leather thong around his neck, and pressing it to his lips. None of the other men asked what the bone was. Aslak would not have told them. These 3 men and the boy would be in that cabin from the 1st of December until the middle of January. The first day, they flew in by helicopter. The pilot, a Finn, did not land, but instead hovered 3 meters off the snow, while the 4 of them threw their gear into the powder and then jumped. Then the helicopter rose and tipped its nose south and was gone, and the sound of its blades faded out into the trees, and there was no sound at all except the wind moving through the high branches 100 feet over their heads. Jonas stood there with his pack on his shoulders, and he looked around. He had never been in a forest like this one. The trees were so tall and so old that their lower branches had died and broken away decades earlier, leaving the trunks standing like the columns of some abandoned cathedral. The light that came down through the canopy was green and very thin. The snow on the ground was 2 meters deep and untouched. There were no tracks, no birds, no sound. Henrik behind him said, "Welcome to Bimarka, boy. Try not to die in it." The cabin was a kilometer from the drop zone. They strapped on the long wooden skis they had brought, and they pulled the gear behind them on a sledge. Aslak went first because Aslak knew the snow. Henrik went last because Henrik did not trust anyone behind him with an axe. Jonas was in the middle. The cabin, when they reached it, was older than any of them had expected. It was a low building of black timber with a steep roof to shed the snow and a single iron stovepipe sticking up from the center. The door faced west. The 2 small windows on the north and south walls were shuttered with plain pine boards. There was no power line. There was no radio mast. Inside the door, Aslak struck a match and lit the kerosene lantern that hung from the ceiling, and the room came into being out of the dark. 4 bunks, a long table, a small wood stove, a stack of split pine, 3 iron pots hanging from hooks, and on the far wall, drawn in something that was not quite paint, 4 black vertical lines about as long as a forearm. Jonas, who was 24 and had not yet learned to keep his curiosity behind his teeth, asked what the lines were. Henrik did not answer. Aslak looked at the lines for a long moment, and then he looked at Jonas and he said, "They are old." That was the only answer Jonas would get for almost a week. For the first 2 days, nothing happened. They worked. The work was hard. They were felling spruce in a stand about 400 meters east of the cabin, and the sound of the chainsaws was the loudest sound in the world. And at the end of each day, they came back through the blue dusk with their faces white with sawdust and their backs aching, and they ate boiled potatoes and dried reindeer, and they drank coffee, and they slept like the dead. On the second night, Henrik told Jonas about the rule. It was after dinner. The fire in the small stove had burned down to a red glow. Aslak was already asleep in his bunk on the far wall, breathing slow and even. Jonas was sitting at the table, cleaning the chain of his saw. Henrik was sitting opposite him, his big hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, looking at Jonas with an expression Jonas could not quite read. Henrik said, "You hear anything outside last night, boy?" Jonas looked up. He thought about it. "No," he said, "only the wind." Henrik nodded slowly. He sipped the coffee. He said, "Good. But you will. Sooner or later in this forest you will. And when you do, you have to know the rule." Jonas waited. Henrik said, If you hear someone calling your name from the trees at night, you do not answer. You do not go to the door. You do not look out the window. You stay in your bunk and you put your head under the blanket and you do not move until morning. Jonas almost smiled. The smile started in the corners of his mouth, and then he saw Henrik's face and he stopped. Henrik said, "If you see a woman in the trees at the edge of the cut, a young woman, beautiful, long hair, maybe a blue dress, maybe a red dress, maybe nothing at all, you do not look at her face, you do not call to her, and you do not, under any circumstance, follow her." Jonas waited for Henrik to laugh, to tell him it was a joke for the new boy, the way the fishermen back in Levanger had told him stories about the kraken on his first day on the dock. But Henrik did not laugh. Henrik finished his coffee and he stood up and he put his cup on the shelf above the stove and he walked over to the wall where the 4 black lines were drawn and he put one hand flat against them. Henrik said, "These were here when I came up here in 1962. There were 3 of them then. The man before me drew the 4th. I do not know why. I do not ask. But I know what they are for. They are for keeping count." Jonas asked very quietly, "Counting what?" Henrik turned and looked at him. The lantern light made shadows in the deep lines of his face. He said, "Men who walked out of this cabin in the middle of the night and who did not come back." He went to his bunk. He pulled off his boots. He lay down. He pulled the blanket up to his chin, and he did not say anything else. Jonas sat at the table for a long time after that, listening. Outside, the wind was rising. In the far corner, Aslak's breathing did not change, but Jonas noticed then that one of Aslak's eyes was open just a little, watching him, watching the door. Jonas did not sleep well that night, but he did not hear anything either. And in the morning, in the gray pre-dawn light, with Henrik already up and feeding the stove and the kettle already starting to whistle, the whole conversation felt distant and a little ridiculous, the way old men's stories always did when the sun came up.